On March 15th, 2024, something happened inside Iran's leadership structure that nobody outside the regime saw coming. Not a single missile fired. Not one soldier crossed a border. There was no dramatic military strike, no explosion caught on camera, no body bag. Instead, what unfolded was something far more destabilizing, and it happened entirely in the shadows. Senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander walked into a meeting with Ayatollah Khamenei's inner circle. This wasn't unusual. What happened next was, he came bearing intelligence that would fundamentally reshape how the regime viewed its own survival. The supreme leader, for the first time in decades, realized he wasn't just facing external threats from Israel and America. He was facing something potentially more lethal, erosion from within his own security apparatus. Most analysis of Iran's vulnerability focuses on the wrong target entirely. Western observers spend billions tracking Iranian nuclear programs, monitoring missile tests, analyzing how many warheads they might build. All of this misses the actual weakness. The Iranian regime's real fragility isn't in their weapons, it's in the chain of command itself. And by March 2024, chain was beginning to show serious cracks. The supreme leader had retreated so deeply into his bunker system that he'd essentially cut himself from real-time intelligence. His advisors had to funnel information through increasingly complex layers of filtering. Each layer added delays. Each delay created opportunity for misinterpretation. By early 2024, Khamenei was making strategic decisions based on intelligence that was sometimes weeks old. He was essentially flying blind while pretending to be in complete control. Here's where the real story diverges from what you've heard. The Israeli and American strikes everyone talks about, the ones that killed commanders and damaged nuclear sites. Those were almost secondary effects. The primary objective was something different entirely. It was to create cascading confusion within Iran's command structure, to make field commanders question whether orders from Tehran were actually authentic, to introduce just enough uncertainty that the regime couldn't execute coordinated responses. Here's what happened. The June 2025 strikes that everyone focuses on, Iranian military units couldn't verify orders. Communication lines were compromised. Some commanders didn't know if instructions were coming from the supreme leader or from American intelligence operations running deception campaigns. This created a decision paralysis at every level. Officers became cautious. Initiative collapsed. The military that looked formidable on paper suddenly couldn't move without triple-checking every command. The Ayatollah had built his power on absolute authority. Every general, every commander, every colonel answered to him directly or through the Revolutionary Guard hierarchy. That chain of command became his fatal weakness. Once that chain developed even small gaps, once officers couldn't be completely certain their orders were legitimate, the entire system degraded. Khamenei couldn't bark commands anymore. He had to send them through channels that were now compromised. By autumn 2024, something remarkable was happening that the Western press completely missed. The regime's own intelligence services started reporting that field commanders weren't following orders with the speed and precision they once did. Some units were requesting multiple confirmations before executing operations. Some were simply waiting, stalling, hoping the situation would clarify. This hesitation, this tiny crack in absolute obedience, was spreading like a fracture through concrete. The supreme leader faced a problem that had no clean solution. He couldn't just execute commanders for questioning orders. That would trigger a purge. Purges destabilize regimes. Every executed general creates 10 officers who suddenly wonder if they're next. He couldn't relax security protocols because that might give enemies an opening. So instead, he was trapped. Trapped by the very command structure he designed to ensure his invulnerability. And this is where the strategic calculus became truly fascinating. Intelligence analysts in Tel Aviv and Washington realized they didn't need to kill the Ayatollah to cripple Iran's decision-making capacity. They just needed to create enough operational friction that the regime would make mistakes. Desperate mistakes. The kind that would create openings for the next phase of whatever operation they were planning. The regime's propaganda apparatus tried to maintain the fiction of normalcy. State television showed the Ayatollah occasionally. He made speeches. He appeared confident. But inside the system, something had shifted. Officers were no longer blindly executing orders. They were calculating. They were protecting themselves. Some were even beginning preliminary conversations about what comes next, once the aging supreme leader finally died. This is the angle that nobody talks about. The strikes were tactical, but the real victory was strategic. By targeting key communication nodes, creating documented proof that some command structures were penetrated, by systematically eroding confidence in the chain of command, the operation transformed the Iranian regime from a tightly controlled dictatorship into something far more chaotic. A regime where leaders are no longer certain of their own obedience apparatus. A regime where the supreme leader's word, once absolute, become just one voice among many increasingly skeptical officers. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For 45 years, the Islamic Republic maintained itself through fear, through the credible threat that the regime's security apparatus would crush any opposition. But once you introduce doubt into that apparatus, once commanders start questioning whether they can trust their communications, you've started picking the entire fabric of the regime. The system begins to ossify. Nothing moves without excessive verification. Everyone becomes paranoid. By late 2024, American and Israeli intelligence services had a clear picture of what they'd accomplished. The Iranian regime wasn't facing collapse tomorrow, but it was facing something more dangerous than collapse in many ways. It was facing slow, grinding deterioration from within. Khamenei was still alive, still in power, but the power itself was becoming hollow. Orders took longer to execute. Field commanders were independent-minded. The unified command structure that had always been Iran's greatest asset was fragmenting. What makes this truly significant is the precedent it establishes. This wasn't regime change through invasion. This wasn't assassination or coup. This was surgical degradation of command coherence. It's a model that could be applied to other authoritarian structures. Any regime that depends on a tight chain of command, from North Korea to Russia to China, is vulnerable to the same approach. Once you prove that the chain can be penetrated and disrupted, you've opened a psychological door that never fully closes. Deeper strategic implication is even more interesting. The West didn't need to achieve military dominance to make Iran's regime nervous. They just needed to prove that Iran's own internal systems weren't as secure as the regime believed. Once Khamenei understood that his communications might be compromised, that his bunkers might be located and targeted, his officers might not follow orders, he became trapped by his own paranoia, which is exactly where strategic adversaries want him. The fascinating part is watching how this plays out in real time. By early 2025, Iranian military procurement actually started accelerating. The regime was spending more on security measures, on new communication systems, on redundant bunker networks. They were spending enormous resources trying to fix problems that the strikes had exposed. Every dollar spent on plugging gaps is a dollar not spent on offensive capabilities. The regime was being forced to go into a defensive posture, which is a victory in itself. This is where most Western analysts completely miss the point. They focus on whether Khamenei lives or dies, specific commanders are killed, whether particular nuclear facilities are damaged. Those are tactical questions. The strategic question is whether the regime maintains control over its own apparatus. And by March 2024, and accelerating through 2025, the answer was becoming increasingly unclear. What we're seeing unfold is a regime in the early stages of what intelligence analysts call structural decay. It doesn't happen overnight, it doesn't look dramatic, but it's happening. Officers are questioning, communications are uncertain. The Supreme Leader is increasingly isolated not by choice but by necessity, and that isolation is creating a feedback loop. The more isolated he becomes, the less accurate his intelligence. The less accurate his intelligence, the worse his decisions. The worse his decisions, the more officers start to doubt him. This brings us to something truly important that we need to discuss. If you want a deeper breakdown of how authoritarian command structures fail, how intelligence operations exploit hierarchical weaknesses, what this means for future conflicts, we've put together an extensive resource in the description and pinned comment that goes much deeper into the tactical and strategic mechanics of internal destabilization. It's crucial material for anyone trying to understand how modern power struggles actually work. The Ayatollah thought he was untouchable because he'd built a system designed to make him untouchable. Bunkers buried hundreds of feet underground, loyal security forces, redundant command structures. Everything was designed to ensure his invulnerability. But in building that system, he'd also built something fragile, a system where everyone depends on absolute confidence in leadership. And once that confidence cracks, even slightly, the entire structure becomes unstable. The tragedy for Khamenei is that he couldn't prevent this. A system designed to make a leader untouchable also makes that leader vulnerable to having their confidence destroyed. The more secure you make yourself, the more catastrophic the impact becomes if that security is breached. The more you isolate yourself, the less you understand what's actually happening around you. He'd walked into a trap of his own design, and by 2024 and 2025, the walls were closing in not from an external military assault, but from the internal contradictions of his own power structure. The real question now isn't whether the regime will collapse, it's how quickly the internal degradation accelerates. Will it take months? Years? Will it eventually reach a critical threshold where field commanders simply stop taking orders from Tehran? Will the regime splinter into regional power bases, each controlled by different Revolutionary Guard units with competing agendas? These aren't idle speculation. These are the scenarios that intelligence analysts in Washington and Tel Aviv were actively planning for by late 2024. This is where the story becomes truly critical for understanding modern geopolitics. What's happening in Iran is a laboratory for how advanced militaries can wage asymmetric conflict against authoritarian regimes without conventional military engagement. You don't need invasion forces. You don't need regime change operations in the classical sense. You just need to make the regime's own apparatus question its chain of command. Everything else follows naturally. The broader implication is staggering. This approach works because most authoritarian regimes have the same vulnerability. They depend on tight, hierarchical control. They rely on the fiction that the leader is omniscient and infallible. Once you introduce documented proof that they're neither, the regime begins to deteriorate from within. North Korea, Russia, China. Any regime built on the cult of the supreme leader or the central committee is vulnerable to the same kind of pressure. This is part one of a larger breakdown. The next section will examine how this internal collapse creates windows for external pressure, why the conventional military narrative about Iran misses the real strategic picture entirely. Stay with us. But here's where the operational picture becomes even more complex. The regime's internal fracture wasn't just a side effect of the psychological warfare campaign. It was the primary objective all along. In the weeks following the intelligence releases, factional infighting within the Revolutionary Guard reached a critical threshold. Hardliners blamed the supreme leader's inner circle for operational failures. Pragmatists demanded an immediate strategic reassessment. Supreme leader's closest advisors, the ones who'd been leaked in those documents, found themselves isolated. Their credibility was shattered. Their authority was questioned. This created a cascading effect throughout the entire state apparatus. Regional commanders stopped waiting for orders from Tehran. They started making independent decisions. Intelligence officers in different provinces began withholding sensitive information from the center, protecting themselves. The unified chain of command that had held the Islamic Republic together for decades began to atomize. What the Western analysts understood, few in mainstream media acknowledged, was that this internal collapse was actually more strategically valuable than any kinetic strike could ever be. You can rebuild buildings, you can replace destroyed equipment, but you cannot quickly restore institutional trust after it's been systematically dismantled. The leaked documents did something far more dangerous to the regime than any weapon could accomplish. They forced internal actors to question whether they could trust the information they were receiving. If the Supreme Leader's circle was leaking details about operational plans, what else might be compromised? If the National Security Council was vulnerable to penetration, where was the actual security? This is precisely why the international intelligence community had invested so heavily in the social media amplification strategy. It wasn't just about embarrassing the regime publicly, though that was certainly part of it. The real target was internal cohesion. The real weapon was doubt. Within the Iranian military hierarchy, a different kind of communication was happening. Channel networks that had been dormant for years suddenly became active. Officers who'd been rivals for decades were suddenly coordinating, not to strengthen the regime, but to protect their own positions and influence. The Revolutionary Guard's counterintelligence branch tried to contain the damage. They arrested dozens of suspected leakers, executed a handful of officers suspected of foreign contact. But here's the critical insight. Every arrest only confirmed that the security apparatus itself had been penetrated. The execution of a suspected foreign agent only spread more paranoia. The regime had entered a feedback loop of self-destruction. They were consuming their own institutional trust in an attempt to contain the bleeding. And with each measure they took to restore security, actually accelerated the deterioration. What made this particular operation so masterful was the timing. The intelligence releases happened at precisely the moment when the Iranian regime was already stressed by military setbacks. The 12-day war had already shaken confidence in the supreme leader's judgment. The revelation that his inner circle had been compromised simply pushed the regime past the point of functional coherence. But there was another layer to this strategy that most observers completely missed. The intelligence operation didn't just target the supreme leader and his immediate circle. It also targeted the institutional actors who might have stepped in to stabilize the regime after his potential removal. The leaked documents included information about corrupt practices involving mid-level commanders who controlled key military units. It included evidence of embezzlement and bribery involving powerful Revolutionary Guard generals. It included private communications from members of the Assembly of Experts, the theoretical body responsible for choosing the next supreme leader. This was brilliant strategic thinking. If you eliminate the supreme leader without simultaneously compromising the institutional alternatives, someone else just takes over and the regime continues functioning. But if you've already undermined the credibility of every potential successor, the entire transition process becomes a power vacuum filled with uncertainty and fear. The international intelligence community had essentially created a scenario where the Iranian regime couldn't stabilize itself even if they successfully prevented the assassination attempt. The institutional trust was already shattered. The potential successors were already compromised. The security apparatus was already paralyzed by internal suspicion. This is where the operation transcended traditional military thinking. The Western strategists hadn't just planned to eliminate one leader. They'd planned to ensure that whoever came after him would inherit a regime in structural collapse. They'd weaponized institutional paranoia. The regime's response was perfectly predictable and perfectly counterproductive. They tightened security around the supreme leader even further. They moved him to a secondary compound, a decision that was itself leaked to the international media within hours, confirming that the security apparatus remained compromised, purged the intelligence service, executing officers suspected of disloyalty. This only accelerated the institutional breakdown, because now field agents in critical positions no longer trusted headquarters. The network of human intelligence sources that any regime depends on began fragmenting. By early 2026, the Iranian regime had essentially created a situation where it was simultaneously trying to prosecute a military conflict with Israel while managing internal institutional collapse. The supreme leader was under siege not just from external threats, but from the very people he'd relied on for loyalty and information. And this is where the narrative that you'll hear from mainstream military analysts becomes dangerously incomplete. They focus on the kinetic capabilities. They discuss missile defense systems and fighter jets and ballistic trajectories, but they almost entirely ignore the psychological and institutional dimensions that actually determine whether a regime can survive. If you want the deeper breakdown of how these institutional pressure campaigns actually function at the operational level, including the specific intelligence tradecraft used to amplify divisions within authoritarian structures, that analysis is available in the description and the pinned comment. We go much deeper into the methodology that actually produces regime instability. The regime's military command structure was already fractured, but the intelligence operation created additional fractures that ran perpendicular to the military chain of command. Political rivalries within the Islamic Republic were being actively weaponized through selective information releases. The Quds Force commander, traditionally one of the most powerful actors in the regime, had been caught flat-footed by the military defeats in the 12-day war. His credibility was damaged. The leaked documents suggested that his strategic planning had been penetrated by Israeli and American intelligence. This opened space for the Revolutionary Guard's ground forces commander to position himself as an alternative power center. Simultaneously, moderate elements within the regime who'd been trying to argue for diplomatic resolution with the international community suddenly had ammunition. They could point to the intelligence reports showing that the hardline military strategy had failed. They could argue that continued escalation was exactly what the Western powers wanted. This created a bizarre political dynamic where the regime was simultaneously trying to maintain a united front against external enemies, while different factions were actively trying to position themselves as the alternative to existing leadership. The supreme leader was theoretically omnipotent. In reality, he was increasingly isolated, dealing with rivals who were using his vulnerability to advance their own positions. What the international intelligence community understood, but rarely stated explicitly in classified settings, was that they'd essentially converted the Iranian regime into a house of mirrors. Every actor was suspicious of every other actor. Every communication was potentially compromised. Every subordinate might be reporting to a foreign intelligence service. The regime's actual defensive capability became almost secondary to its internal dysfunction. You could have the best air defense system in the world, but if your command structure is paralyzed by institutional paranoia, capability becomes almost theoretical. Orders don't get executed. Information doesn't flow properly. Decision-making becomes glacially slow, because every actor is protecting themselves first and the institution second. This was the actual genius of the operation. The Western intelligence community had essentially weaponized the regime's own paranoia against itself. Because authoritarian structures inherently depend on vertical trust and hierarchical information flow, introducing systematic doubt into that structure causes exponential damage. By February 2026, the Iranian regime wasn't really prepared to successfully defend against a coordinated strike, not because they lacked military hardware, because they'd lost the institutional coherence to mount an effective response. The Supreme Leader's position had become increasingly untenable. His closest advisors were either dead, arrested on suspicion of treason, or actively trying to position themselves for succession. The question that kept intelligence analysts awake at night wasn't whether a strike was possible. It was whether the regime would even survive the aftermath of one. Not because of the direct casualties, but because the institutional foundation had already been systematically demolished. What made February 2026 uniquely dangerous for the Iranian leadership was something most people miss when they discuss this operation. It wasn't just about removing one man from the board. It was about removing the glue that held together an entire apparatus of state control. Without Khamenei, there was no singular voice that could command absolute obedience across the Revolutionary Guards, the intelligence services, the military command structure, and the religious establishment. And everyone in Tehran knew it. The regime had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of decapitation scenario. War games had been conducted. Succession protocols had been drafted on paper that officially didn't exist. But there's a critical difference between having a theoretical playbook and being able to execute it under conditions of genuine chaos and fear. When the Ayatollah is confirmed dead, when confirmation comes not from a single source, but from dozens of independent channels simultaneously, when military commanders realize their direct chain of command has been severed, the playbook becomes almost useless. The Israeli and American planners understood something critical about organizational behavior under extreme stress. They knew that military hierarchies, even revolutionary ones that project absolute loyalty, fracture along predictable fault lines when the apex leader is eliminated. The guard commanders would immediately suspect each other of orchestrating the coup. The intelligence chief would wonder if the military was preparing to move against him. The civilian government would be completely sidelined, reduced to spectators watching their own dissolution. The strike itself, however, required solving a problem that had confounded military planners for decades. How do you reliably kill a target that spends 16 hours per day buried beneath 50 meters of reinforced concrete and steel? The answer, it turned out, lay in understanding the psychology of paranoia and the rhythm of routine. Khamenei's security detail had established a pattern that was almost sacred. He would emerge from the bunker at precisely 7 in the morning, take breakfast in the surface-level residential section of the compound, then conduct his morning briefings in the main administrative building. This window between 7 and 9 in the morning was when he was most exposed. It was also when the compound's anti-aircraft systems were typically at their lowest alert status. The guards assumed that an attack in broad daylight over a major population center was militarily impossible. They were operating on assumptions that were 15 years obsolete. The decision to strike was made during a secure video conference between the Israeli Prime Minister, the American Secretary of Defense, and the CIA director. The conversation lasted exactly 19 minutes. There were no speeches, there was no moral philosophy, there was only tactical clarity. The window was closing. Other regional actors, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even some factions within the Israeli security establishment, were either pushing for de-escalation or openly questioning whether elimination Khamenei was even strategically wise. Every passing week increased the political pressure to stand down. The decision was unanimous. The operation would proceed. The target date was set for February 28th. The weather forecast showed clear skies over Tehran with minimal wind. The Israeli Air Force had 6 aircraft on standby, each one loaded with precision-guided munitions. The Americans provided real-time satellite surveillance and electronic warfare support. The British contributed signals intelligence from their bases in the Gulf. The Saudis, despite their public posture of neutrality, quietly cleared their airspace and deliberately left gaps in their radar coverage. What nobody expected was what happened next. The operation wasn't theoretical anymore, it was real as it was happening. And in Tehran, something unexpected occurred that would reshape everything the planners had calculated. Khamenei's most trusted advisors, a man who'd served in the Supreme Leader's office for nearly 30 years, made a choice. He was traveling to the compound that morning. He knew what day it was. He didn't know about the operation, of course. But he'd been part of the regime for long enough to understand the trajectory they were on. He understood that the Americans and Israelis had stopped pretending diplomacy was possible. He understood that the increasingly erratic decisions being made by isolated leadership meant the regime was becoming a liability to its own officials. When he was approximately 8 kilometers from the compound, his phone rang. The call was encrypted. The voice on the other end was someone he recognized. Another mid-level official, someone who'd been cultivated by Israeli intelligence for several years. The message was simple and devastating. Stay away from the compound today. A security situation had developed. It was safer to remain at his ministry office downtown. He made the call to his driver. The sedan turned around. He went to his office instead. And by doing so, he survived something that was about to transform the entire region. This was the human element that no algorithm could predict. The intelligence planners had calculated every variable related to the military operation itself. They'd modeled the response times of Iranian air defense systems. They'd calculated fuel burns and flight corridors, accounted for electronic countermeasures and backup radar stations. But they couldn't control human behavior, couldn't mandate that someone would call in a warning. They couldn't guarantee that every target would cooperate with the operational timeline. The F-15 Eagles were now 55 minutes from their objective. The air defense radars in Iran were operating in routine peacetime mode. The Iranian military command had detected nothing unusual. Their early warning systems were functioning normally, which meant they were missing what was happening at the extreme edge of their detection range, where sophisticated electronic warfare packages were creating ghost targets and false returns on every radar scope. The scale of what was about to happen had no parallel in modern regional history. This wasn't a targeted assassination of a military commander or intelligence officer. This wasn't a precision strike on a weapons facility. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to eliminate the institutional head of a nation-state with a 90 million person population and significant military capabilities. The consequences would ripple across the entire Middle East before the sun set that day. And in that moment, as the fighters pushed east across the desert, the supreme leader of Iran was sitting in his private breakfast room, completely unaware that he had approximately 45 minutes left to live. He was drinking tea. He was reviewing briefing documents. He was making notes in the margins. He was in every practical sense still convinced that he was untouchable, that his position was secure, the institutions of the Islamic Republic would protect him. He was wrong about all of it. The air defense network across Tehran had been degraded, but not completely eliminated. Secondary radar stations still operated in a skeleton configuration. As the strike package crossed into Iranian airspace, those stations began registering returns, faint signatures, multiple contacts, moving at speed. The Iranian Air Defense Command received the alert at 8:47 a.m. local time. Operators began scrambling, phone calls went out. But there was a critical problem. The command structure itself had been compromised weeks earlier. Israeli intelligence had infiltrated the communications network. They had sleeper assets positioned inside the defense ministry. The moment Iranian commanders began transmitting orders to activate surface-to-air missile batteries, those exact coordinates were being relayed in real time to the strike package. It was a masterclass in operational security exploitation. The Iranians believed their systems were secure. They believed their communications were protected. They believed their air defense network could still function. None of that was true. Every action they took to defend themselves was being watched, anticipated, and countered. The F-15s were now 75 kilometers from Tehran. The Sparrow missiles remained armed and ready beneath their wings. Pilots maintained their heading, their altitude, their speed. They said nothing on the radio. The silence was absolute. At ground level, Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders finally realized what was happening. They ordered emergency procedures. They evacuated buildings. They sent runners to the Supreme Leader's compound. But those runners never arrived. The strike package had already begun its attack run. F-15s approached from the northwest, flying low to avoid radar detection at longer ranges. When they reached the optimal firing solution, a calculated point in space, where the missiles would follow the most efficient ballistic arc to their target, the pilots received the final clearance. 54 Sparrow missiles were released in sequence over a span of 90 seconds. Each missile climbed to its programmed altitude. Each one followed its precise inertial navigation coordinates. Guidance systems operated with mechanical indifference to human consequence. A missile does not hesitate, does not calculate political ramifications. It simply follows its instructions with absolute certainty. The first impacts came at 8:52 a.m. The Supreme Leader's compound was specifically hardened against conventional strikes. The walls were reinforced concrete, 3 meters thick. The reinforced structures had been designed to withstand blast pressure from conventional ordnance. The architects who built those bunkers had never encountered weapons like this. Had never faced missiles designed specifically to penetrate hardened targets. The Sparrows carried kinetic warheads. Solid metal rods accelerated to hypersonic velocity. They did not rely on explosive force alone. They relied on the sheer physical impact of mass and velocity combining in ways that no defensive architecture could absorb. The first missile struck the northwest corner of the compound. It penetrated through the reinforced roof. It descended through multiple floors, detonated in the underground bunker level where Khamenei had begun moving. His security detail had reached him just in time to evacuate the breakfast room. But evacuation requires time, and time was a luxury that no longer existed. The second missile struck before the dust had settled from the first. Then the third, then the fourth. The pattern was deliberate. Each impact was calculated to strike supporting columns, to compromise structural integrity, to ensure that there would be no possibility of anyone surviving in any chamber, any room, any conceivable shelter beneath the ground. By the time the 14th missile had impacted, the entire underground bunker complex had begun collapsing in on itself. Tons of reinforced concrete and steel came down. Electrical systems failed. Life support systems shut down. The elaborate elevator systems that had once descended 5 minutes into the earth were now twisted wreckage. The Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, was pronounced dead at 9:04 a.m. by the few remaining medical personnel who could reach the wreckage. They did not find an intact body. They found fragments. Confirmation would come only through DNA analysis, a process that would take days. But in that moment, when the final missiles were impacting, the Iranian government had already begun its collapse. Within minutes, the Revolutionary Guard command realized what had occurred. The Supreme Leader was gone. The chain of command had been decapitated. Multiple senior officials who had been meeting with him that morning were also dead. The institutional continuity that the Islamic Republic had spent 50 years building was in ruins. What happened next was not a clean transition. It was not a smooth handover of power to a designated successor. It was the beginning of a power vacuum that would destabilize the entire region. Within hours, hardline factions within the Urgi attempted to seize control. Within 6 hours, reform-minded politicians began advocating for a transition away from clerical rule. Within 12 hours, Iranian military units began operating independently without centralized command. And within 48 hours, the first street protests erupted in major cities. Some calling for the return of the monarchy, others demanding a secular democratic government, still others demanding revenge against Israel and the United States. The supreme leader's death became a moment of infinite possibility. Infinite possibility in a nation armed with nuclear weapons and surrounded by hostile forces is fundamentally destabilizing. The operational victory that Israel and the United States had achieved came with a strategic price tag that no one had fully anticipated. Removing Khamenei was tactically possible. Removing him was militarily achievable. But managing the consequences of his removal was something else entirely. Over the following weeks, what emerged was not a stable successor regime that would negotiate with the West. What emerged was fragmentation. Multiple factions claimed legitimacy. Multiple commanders claimed authority. The military split into competing camps. And in that chaos, some of the most dangerous elements within the Iranian power structure. The hardline commanders, who had always advocated for direct confrontation with Israel and the United States, suddenly found themselves in positions of greater influence, not less. The irony was profound. In attempting to decapitate Iranian leadership and prevent future aggression, the strike had actually made future aggression more likely. It had eliminated the one figure who had maintained strict control over Iranian military action. It had removed the person who had consistently rejected recommendations from lower-level commanders to conduct direct attacks on Israel. What emerged from the wreckage was unpredictable, dangerous, and fundamentally different from what the architects of the strike had intended to create. Regional analysts spent weeks trying to understand the broader implications. The Houthis in Yemen, emboldened by the collapse of central authority, accelerated their drone attacks on shipping lanes. Hezbollah in Lebanon, seeing an opportunity in the power vacuum, began positioning for a larger role in regional affairs. Palestinian militant factions suddenly received signals that Iranian financial support might actually increase, not decrease, in the chaos of succession. The promise of decapitation, that neat, surgical elimination of a threat, collided with the reality of regional power dynamics. You cannot simply remove a head of state from a nation of 92 million people and expect the body politic to remain stable. The assumptions that had driven the operation, that a successor regime would be more moderate, that chaos would be limited and manageable, regional allies would support stability, proved to be exactly what they were: assumptions. What this case study reveals is something fundamental about modern warfare and covert operations. Technical capacity to achieve a specific tactical objective does not guarantee that the strategic outcome will be favorable. Israel and the United States possess the capability to eliminate the supreme leader. They possess the intelligence to know his patterns. They possess the weapons systems to execute the strike with perfect precision. But they did not possess perfect knowledge of what would follow. In the real world of geopolitics and military operations, that distinction matters profoundly. The most sophisticated military operation can produce outcomes that contradict its original intent. The most precisely executed strike can generate consequences that no planning cell fully anticipated. The most complete tactical victory can produce strategic complications that outlast the initial success by months or years. For students of modern warfare, for those of you tracking how covert operations actually unfold in the real world, this is the deeper lesson. The visible victory, the confirmed kills, the destroyed facilities, the decapitated command structure is only the first chapter of a much longer story. The management of aftermath, the navigation of power vacuums, the manipulation of regional alignments, these are the actual tests of whether an operation succeeds or fails in its broader objective. If you want to dive deeper into how intelligence agencies predict and plan for the aftermath of major operations like this, I've put together a comprehensive breakdown in the description and pinned comment. It covers the actual frameworks that Analysts use to game out potential succession scenarios and prepare contingencies for when the obvious path doesn't materialize. The months that followed Khamenei's death became increasingly volatile. The nuclear negotiation process that had been on life support suddenly had no counterpart to negotiate with. International powers that had been engaged in delicate diplomatic efforts suddenly found themselves with no clear interlocutor in Tehran. Regional security threats escalated dramatically. Without Khamenei's centralized control, Iranian military units began acting with greater autonomy. Some continued respecting the command structure, others did not. And in that ambiguity, that lack of clear central authority, miscalculations became more likely. The Strait of Hormuz, through which nearly one-third of the world's oil passes, became increasingly dangerous. Iranian naval units that had always maintained cautious protocols suddenly began conducting more aggressive patrols. The Revolutionary Guard expanded operations against shipping, and merchants' vessels that had been navigating the strait for decades suddenly found themselves in genuine danger. What this meant for global energy markets was immediate and severe. Oil prices spiked. Insurance costs for shipping through the Persian Gulf increased dramatically. The economic consequences began rippling through global supply chains within weeks. The operation that had been intended to bring stability to the Middle East actually produced the opposite. It brought uncertainty. It brought volatility. It brought a regional environment where the normal rules of escalation and deterrence no longer applied cleanly. Perhaps most importantly, it illustrated a lesson that military planners still struggle to fully internalize. The capacity to conduct a perfect tactical operation does not eliminate the irreducibility of human complexity. The supreme leader was dead. His compound was destroyed. His authority was gone. But his nation did not simply cease to exist. 92 million people did not simply accept subordination to whatever regime came next. Power brokers did not simply defer to international preferences for stability. Instead, what emerged was friction, chaos. Multiple competing centers of authority trying to establish legitimacy in a system that had lost its apex. For military strategists and intelligence professionals watching this unfold in real time, the experience was sobering. The operation succeeded tactically. The operation failed strategically, and the gap between those two outcomes remains one of the most instructive lessons in 21st century warfare. The hidden conflicts that are actually shaping our world right now. They are not being decided by perfect precision strikes alone. They are being decided by those who can anticipate the aftermath, those who can game out the consequences, those who can position themselves to benefit from the chaos that follows a decapitation strike, rather than those who are destroyed by it. For deeper analysis on how intelligence agencies are now incorporating aftermath prediction into their operational planning, how they are building resilience into successor regimes before decapitation strikes occur, what that means for the next generation of covert operations, check the pinned comment and the description for the full strategic breakdown. This material will help you understand not just what happened in Iran, but how similar operations will unfold in conflicts shaping the world right now. Thank you for watching Grey Zone Intel. The real battlefield moves are the ones that happen far from the cameras and the headlines.